I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream.
We know him now as an icon of human rights. Martin Luther King, the dreamer, champion of racial justice, oracle and visionary of a better society.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
But there's another side to this man, a side that's in danger of being forgotten.
God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God didn't call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war.
King, the apocalyptic seer, the raging prophet of God's judgment on America and Western culture.
God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me. If you don't stop your reckless course, I'll rise up and break the backbone of your power.
King, the preacher of salvation to a lost world.
What I'm saying today is, America, you must be born again.
40 years after his assassination, I'm going on a journey in search of this forgotten king. What sort of religion did he believe in? What made him tick? My own political career has left me questioning the role of religion in society. I wonder, are we suppressing King's spiritual side for a reason? Does it just make us feel too uncomfortable? Are we airbrushing King the preacher out of history because his faith embarrasses and disturbs us in our own religiously uncertain and fearful times? And if so, what exactly are we in danger of losing? One of the basic facts about Martin Luther King that it's easy to forget is that before he was a civil rights leader, he was a Baptist pastor, and he remained one to the end of his life.
This I know, if Jesus leads me, I shall get home someday.
But that's not how history remembers and celebrates Martin Luther King, and it's certainly not how I think of him. I'm what you might call a devout atheist. I'm not religious at all, and I've always thought of Martin Luther King in secular, political terms, someone who brought about massive change in America through the power of his vision. And I probably would have rejected the idea that that vision was fundamentally religious. So just how wrong was I? I've come to the southern states of America to find out to what degree Martin Luther King's mission was inspired and shaped by his religious beliefs.
Atlanta, Georgia, capital of the New South and home to Martin Luther King. Also home to many of my King family members, but it's a common name and we're no relation. Having said that, I do feel a really close affinity to this place, not least because my uncle was Martin Luther King's lawyer when he was first arrested, and my family's history, like the history of so many African Americans, is intimately linked to the civil rights movement led from here by Martin Luther King.
My dad's family are from Georgia. My uncle, Shaveen King, was one of a handful of black lawyers in the whole state, and he represented Martin Luther King in a number of cases. That's me, aged 3, with my dad, Preston King. He came to Britain in 1961, fleeing vicious segregation laws in Albany, Georgia. He lived as an exile from America for 40 years until he was pardoned in 2000 by President Clinton. So I grew up feeling very close to the civil rights movement and to Martin Luther King. His causes were our causes. But now I wonder, how much did I really understand him? The obvious starting point for my journey is Dad. After his 40 years in exile, he's now back living here in Atlanta, where he's a professor of political philosophy. So Dad, I never knew you actually met Martin Luther King. I mean, I'm kind of awed by that. I can't believe you'd never even mentioned that to me either. Anyway, what was he like?
The most extraordinary thing was that he didn't come across as a preacher at all. You know, you think of preachers as sort of stentorian creatures who are holding forth in some super divine way. And he was a picture of modesty and inquiry, and he wanted to know what we thought about what was going on. What you felt was, here was a guy who was very bright. He was intellectual. Now, that's what we were, do you see? I mean, we were very interested in ideas, and he was interested in ideas.
Were you religious? Was everyone religious?
I was never asked what I believed. I was never asked to declare a belief. What I had to do was to go to church. And one of the reasons why the black church has the reach that it has is precisely because it's not terribly theological. It is communitarian. How far you believed it is something that I think most people tended to keep to themselves.
Did Martin Luther King keep to himself how far he believed?
He clearly believed in a personal deity. He believed that there was something out there. But remember, religion is 1,000 things to 1,000 different people.
So for Dad, who's a bit of an agnostic, religion was mainly important to King because it was part of community life. But if that's the case, it's certainly a part of King's upbringing that went very deep indeed. Generations of his family were steeped in the African-American religious experience. Just a few miles from the suburb where Dad now lives is the community that nurtured Martin Luther King. This is Auburn Avenue, the heart of Black Atlanta, where King was raised and came to terms with life in the segregated South. Just up the street is Ebenezer Baptist, the church where he grew up, and the family links are strong.
No man has earned the right to go about boasting about the color of his skin or the texture of his hair.
His father, Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King as he was known, was the minister here until the 1970s. According to the present minister of Ebenezer, Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, the church and civil rights went hand in hand for this family of preachers.
When you walk around the environs of Ebenezer Baptist Church, talk to many of its older members, you get a sense of the very strong pastoral presence of Daddy King. A very powerful figure in his own right, a man we often forget who actually led a voting rights struggle for blacks in 1935. But Martin Luther King Sr. laid the foundation in a real sense.
But he wasn't the first one of the family, was he?
No. Martin Luther King Jr.'s maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so as Dr. King once said, not only am I a Baptist preacher, I'm the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of a Baptist preacher. This is my heritage and my essential identity.
King Jr. had seen the huge respect and status that ministers like his father were accorded in the black community. So perhaps it's no surprise that he himself decided to enter the ministry when he was still a teenager. But I can't help wondering how strong his personal faith was. The church was virtually the only powerful black institution, and becoming a preacher was one route to prestige and influence within the African American community. So could it be that he was using the church as a career path? King began his further education here at Morehouse College in Atlanta, the elite college for black men, and this also happens to be where my dad now teaches.
I cut my teeth on a little library over in the corner there.
How old were you?
I was no more than 15 at the time.
How old
Reading
was Martin Luther
stuff.
King when he came here?
He was 15 when he came here, yeah.
What were these young black kids doing at university at the age of 15?
Well, they'd sort of get out of school. People would reckon they'd learned as much as they could, and then they'd go on to college. And often there were special schemes that were worked out to enable them to do so. But people did.
Interestingly, when King arrived here as a young teenager, he didn't have a great deal of time for the church, and becoming a minister certainly didn't figure high on his plans. Apparently, King was rather dismissive of his background. Dad suggests I visit the King Memorial Chapel at Morehouse and talk to the dean, Dr. Lawrence Carter, to find out why.
He could not see how the emotionalism of the black church and specifically the Black Baptist Church, connected with the reality of the Negro in the American South. It was a reality of oppression, of segregation, of gross discrimination, economically and socially. He could not discern how Christianity, as it was being practiced, he didn't see how that was going to make a difference when people left church.
But King's views began to change, and among the many scholars who influenced his new view of the ministry was Benjamin Mays, president of Morehouse, who stressed the importance of moral consistency.
One of his strong themes was you can't talk democracy and segregate. You can't preach love and then hate. And Martin King learned a good deal about what hypocrisy was and what integrity was from Mays.
So glad I got good religion. So glad I got good religion.
King's religious ideas developed further at seminary and during his PhD at Boston University, where he was influenced by a wide range of philosophers and religious thinkers. But how would King's intellectual religious theories work when confronted with the harsh realities of the Deep South? To find out, I'm travelling 150 miles south of Atlanta to Montgomery, Alabama. In 1954, King, now married to Coretta Scott, accepted a call to become minister of Dexter Avenue Baptist, a small black church in the heart of the city. Dexter was quite a well-to-do church with many teachers and lecturers from local black colleges. But no matter what the status of King's congregation may have been back then, every time they gathered here for worship, they were reminded of the truth about their racial situation. There's great symbolism here because the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is actually right next to the Alabama State Capitol building. So when Martin Luther King began his ministry here, he was preaching literally in the shadow of what had been the capital of the slave-owning South, the Confederacy. Even now, the building with its statue of President Jefferson Davis and imposing monument to the Confederate forces is an uncomfortable reminder that Montgomery was the spiritual home of white supremacy. Mary Jo Smiley was a newly married member of Dexter and remembers Martin Luther King settling in as its minister.
I met him, but he did not impress me at all. I don't know whether I should say that. But the first time I went to church to hear him, he mesmerized me.
The first real test of his leadership came a few months later when King found himself embroiled in a struggle that went well beyond the confines of his church. The arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery bus had sparked a widespread protest in the black community. Much to his surprise, King found himself elected leader of a citywide bus boycott.
You must remember that Martin didn't come to Montgomery to lead a boycott. He came to Montgomery to be the pastor of Dexter. And all of a sudden, he was just thrust into that position.
But King's oratory at the mass meetings electrified his audiences and encouraged them to believe that anything was possible.
If that man had told me to dance in a fire, I would have walked right in it and tried to dance. He could talk to people on their levels and make them feel like kings and queens. He instilled in them new dignity, a new purpose for life. a new road to travel.
And this was indeed a new road. Previous civil rights protests tended to focus on legal actions in the courts. What King was now putting together in Montgomery was different. A mass movement involving ordinary people committed to pacifist methods, change through non-violent resistance.
We are going to continue to stand up for what we know is right, and that Alabama will have to face the fact that we are determined to be free.
Martin Luther King called on people to be united in a distinctly Christian movement where love of neighbour and a commitment to social justice went hand in hand. Now, I would say that social justice and neighbourly love are not exclusively Christian values, but the question remains, was Martin Luther King simply repeating pre-prepared religious formulas because he felt that was expected of him as a Christian minister? Well, the depth of his faith and his commitment to non-violent resistance were very quickly put to the test. Within days of the start of the boycott, it became clear to King himself that in viciously racist Alabama, his approach was beset with serious dangers. He began receiving death threats. It must have been very tempting to the young idealist to back away from the whole situation. I've come to the parsonage where King and his family lived, and I'm with Reverend Michael Thurman, present minister of Dexter Avenue, to find out about the moment in King's life that defined his response to this and future struggles. When Martin Luther King came here and began his ministry, do you think at any point he decided he'd got out of his depth?
Well, there was a critical point in early January, late January of 1956, right after the bus boycott would have started.
How old was he?
He would have been about 26 years old.
So he's a really young man.
Quite young. And that particular evening, he got a call late that night, about midnight. And he had received threats in the past, but this one just somehow really agitated him to the core of his being.
King later recalled this experience in one of his sermons.
But I never will forget one night, very late. The telephone started ringing and I picked it up. On the other end was an ugly voice. That voice said to me in substance, "Nigger, we are tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're gonna blow your brains out and blow up your house."
After he received the phone call, he came into the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee, just trying to recollect himself. You can imagine the experience was such a moving and profound experience. He was just literally gripped with fear. I mean, his life had been threatened. And he sat here and he felt like giving up.
And I got to the point that I couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. Something said to me, "You gotta call on that something and that person that your daddy used to tell you about. That power that can make a way out of no way." I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself.
So what do you think this experience here in this kitchen meant for Martin Luther King?
Una, I think this experience in this kitchen was a pivotal moment for Dr. King. That gave him the moral fortitude, the moral strength, the moral courage, the moral backbone to be able to stand against the evils of his time In that moment, in that instant, a leader was born.
When King first decided to follow in his father's footsteps, he may well have thought he was just entering the family business. But whatever happened that night in Dexter Parsonage, by his own admission, King now felt called to fulfill a special mission from God. And it enabled him to lead the bus protesters to a great victory in Montgomery. After a year-long protest, the city authorities were forced to desegregate the buses. King now emerged as the leader of a new kind of movement, one that was prepared to confront racial evil with non-violent resistance. And many African Americans now began to see his leadership in religiously charged, almost messianic terms. This extraordinary mural in the hall at Dexter Avenue was painted by local artist John Fagan.
After being a student here at Alabama State and attending this church, and Reverend King was my pastor, I wanted to commemorate some of the events that happened during the bus boycott and during his time as a leader of the civil rights movement.
How was it like for yourself during this time? What attitude did your parents have towards Martin Luther King and what he was doing here in this church?
They were afraid that something would happen to me if I participated in the movement. But once they knew the man, knew what he stood for, then they were on board with the program. Because they've never had a man with this type of courage, and a man that was so humble, a man that was so loving and giving, and that was not only to his church, but to the whole community. And they loved him, and they would have followed him anywhere.
What about you?
Me too. Yes, I was in that bunch.
This is really fascinating because everybody sees Martin Luther King as an iconic figure. The minute you see an image of him, you immediately think human rights. But this goes way beyond the usual secular symbolism that we're used to. It is a religious image of a holy person or a saint, someone who inspires faith. And King himself now seems to have been unashamed to frame his mission in overtly religious terms.
God has told me that he wants freedom for his people. And I'm not going to run from the responsibility. It may even mean physical death, but if it means that I will die standing up for the freedom of my people, God has spoken to me.
It's hard for us in modern Britain to really get a handle on this type of Christianity. For a start, we don't do God, or so someone said. Or if we do religion, it's usually an entirely private matter, or maybe some view it as a harmless hobby, or others link it exclusively to fundamentalist lunatics. King's religion doesn't fit any of these stereotypes. Like it or not, here was a significant public figure, a revered public figure, who most definitely did do God. I can see that King's faith must have inspired him and others to action, but practical politics is a messy business, and King and his movement became immersed in it. I wonder if his religion got squeezed out in the process. I'm heading back to Atlanta, the city to which he returned in 1960 after the years in Montgomery. This is where he based the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, an organisation he'd founded to take his campaigns to towns and cities across the South. As the name suggests, it was a Christian movement, and according to Dorothy Cotton, who ran its citizenship education program, SCLC deliberately sought to radicalize black Christians.
I wanted to force them to think about who they were, and they would come from a religious, spiritual basis for being a citizen. But somewhere in that dialogue, somebody would would just touch on the notion that there was some law somewhere. That's what I wanted to hear. Yes, what is that law? It is the Constitution of the United States. Yes, so this word, Constitution, would go on the chalkboard, and you could see people start to stand a little taller. Yes, it is the supreme law of the land. It has an amendment that establishes your citizenship, and you don't have to be a victim anymore. The civil rights movement was a singing movement. We could begin the workshop singing songs that they wanted to sing. One that was sung a lot was a song speaking of coming from the sorrow. I've been in the storm so long. I've been in the storm so long, children. I've been in the storm so long. Give me a little time to pray. Okay, the sorrow, and it is expressed. But by about the middle of the week, when people had understood now that the 14th Amendment meant them, the First Amendment meant them, the songs were totally different. The songs became songs of hope and celebration. I'm gonna vote because the Spirit says vote. If we had a voter education drive going, as we often did, I'm gonna vote when the Spirit says vote. When the Spirit says vote, and somebody would yell, for my freedom. If the Spirit says vote, I'm gonna vote, oh Lord. I'm gonna vote because the Spirit says vote. From the sorrow to the hope and to the celebration. And that was empowering.
And liberating.
And very, very liberating.
But the fact is, the SCLC weren't the only ones to make use of religion. Both sides of the racial divide traded in the currency of faith and righteousness. The Ku Klux Klan used the cross as a symbol of power and intimidation. A few people got killed in those landmark civil rights protests of the early 60s. A lot more got beaten up and badly injured. Among them was my Uncle Shaveen, whose picture appeared in newspapers all over America after he was attacked by a county sheriff while visiting a client.
I don't know what a beating like that would have meant to my uncle. I mean, he was a realist, so maybe he thought it was just a normal part of a normal day's work in the abnormal, racist South. But to Martin Luther King, these acts of violence, this innocent suffering was imbued with religious significance. They were to him a reminder of the most important act of injustice in history, the crucifixion.
With the cross of Jesus as his motivation and example, King really seems to have believed that suffering could be redemptive and that God could change even the most hopeless situation through the power of love. As a non-religious person, I find these ideas a bit ethereal, so I've come to talk to one of Dr. King's closest friends and colleagues to find out how seriously King took his theology.
Mr. Young, thank you very much for having me at your office.
Andrew Young was one of a group of radical preachers who gathered around King in the SCLC. He later went on to become US ambassador to the UN and the first black mayor of Atlanta. But in 1963, he was Martin Luther King's right-hand man and closely involved in the decision to launch a historic campaign in Birmingham, the southern bastion of racial segregation.
I think one criteria for Martin's decision was that this was something he felt that was a call of God to help his children who were less fortunate or who were in need.
I mean, I get a bit frustrated when people imply you have to do it because you're religious. You could do it because it's the right thing to do as well.
I certainly would not have been bothered with this if I had not been a religious person. All of our thinking about this was very biblical. I mean, Martin Luther King talked about Moses and the children of Israel in Egypt and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years of segregation and coming to a promised land of creative integration. I mean, these were all very biblical concepts that he believed and lived by.
In Birmingham, King persisted with peaceful protests, this time led by children. But even these provoked violent reactions from the city authorities, and King's young followers were set upon by police with dogs and hoses.
Wade in the water, come on and wade in the water, children, wade in the water.
The Birmingham campaign tested King's religious principles of non-violence to the limit. Such injustice against children provoked feelings of revenge among sections of the black community. Amazingly, King held his nerve.
We must meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force. That is still a voice crying out through the vista of time, saying, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Pray for them that despitefully use you.
King's Christian pacifism only infuriated the segregationists further. A number of white church leaders in Birmingham publicly denounced him as a dangerous extremist. But King turned their condemnation to his advantage. On Good Friday, 1963, he offered himself up for arrest. And from his prison cell, he penned a famous letter that in one stroke of brilliance brought whites and blacks together on the same side of the struggle. He wrote to his critics that he wanted to be, like Jesus, an extremist for love. Today, extremism has a negative connotation. What do you think he meant?
An extremist for love means that you would lay down your life not only for your friend and for your brother, but for your enemy. And in a way, he was saying that the struggle for freedom was a struggle not only to liberate black people, but white people as well. Our slogan was to redeem the soul of America. But the idea of redemption, you don't get any more religious than that. That's a clearly religious word. And to redeem the soul of a nation it's the religious concept of the 1960s.
This concept was too much for white supremacists and even for some in the American establishment to take. His enemies began a campaign to destroy King's religious credibility. A common tactic was to associate his radicalism with atheism and communism, the bugbears of the Cold War era. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, was also skeptical of King's Christianity, and from 1963 on, he ordered King to be kept under surveillance. Hoover publicly alleged that King was the most notorious liar in America. The FBI spread rumors that he was a womanizer. I can see why his enemies would want to portray King as a wolf in sheep's clothing, but I'm curious to ask Andrew Young whether there was any substance to these claims.
I can't understand that because there was no attempt on his part to devour anybody. He was a strictly honest man. He never took a salary. Was he a saint? Did he aspire to live a perfect life? Yes. Did he sin and fall short of the glory of God? Yes, as we all do. But he made no pretense about being anybody's savior or anybody's perfect person. But his problem was with his obedience to God and doing the most that he could for his fellow human beings.
You could argue whether or not King lived up to his religious ideals in his private life, but what I, and probably most people, remember him best for is that famous and iconic speech at the Lincoln Memorial. It was 1963, and King spoke about a dream he'd had. I don't remember it having much to do with God or religion.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Equality, human rights, a civilized society. Surely this was the real king. Liberal, pragmatic, and in tune with the free spirit of the 60s. I'm back at his old church, Ebenezer Baptist, to talk with Professor Richard Lisher about the dream. In studying King's speeches, he's found that even the most secular of them were mining deep biblical themes. And it's no accident we're meeting here.
There is a direct line from the African American pulpit, which is usually elevated high and lifted up in the church, to that mightily elevated pulpit at the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King was addressing an America that was angry and still almost completely segregated. Instead of reading off a bill of particulars of how this has got to change tomorrow, he said instead, "It seems to me I can see something."
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
The prophet is called a seer, and in this case, I see black people and white people sitting down at the table of brotherhood and treating one another as if they were kin, because they are kin. Well, nobody had seen that. And in Hebrew scripture and in the theology of the Old Testament, once a prophet utters something from God, once the prophet has seen it and spoken it, it will happen. It will come to be. And then he quotes from the prophet Isaiah.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
The prophet announces the coming of a new day of God's righteousness and justice. And it won't be in some other universe, it will be on this earth. King believed that.
What does it mean if quite a lot of people like me have never really considered the religious aspect of Martin Luther King's speeches? I mean, do you think we're actually missing something?
You're not receiving an accurate or full portrait of Martin Luther King. I think this is the danger of a national holiday in memory of and in honor of Martin Luther King, because the United States is interested always to separate religious expression and civil expression. So there is something that is sheared off, as it were, by a secular reading of Martin Luther King. It's not the full man, it's not the whole person, and what is sheared off in King is the actual nature of his hope.
So let freedom ring. When we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Ironically, it's the diverse and tolerant society that King helped create that may have airbrushed his faith out of the picture, simply so that all of us, believers and non-believers alike, can celebrate his achievements. At the time, of course, the dream transformed Martin Luther King into an icon of human rights, and he pushed ahead with his campaigns against segregation. But a growing number of blacks were becoming increasingly angry at the slow pace of change in America and embracing a more revolutionary vision. Militants like Malcolm X preached complete separation from oppressive white society, and he ridiculed the idea of peaceful change, dismissing King's non-violence as the philosophy of the fool. While King was having a dream, he quipped, the rest of us Negroes are having a nightmare. In these tense and unpredictable times, King's leadership and principles were tested as perhaps never before in an obscure little town called Selma, deep in the heart of Alabama. Here, a group of black teachers led by Dr. Frederick Reese had launched a concerted campaign for voting rights, rights that were, incredibly, still routinely denied to black people in the South. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference became involved in the struggle, and at the time in Selma, no one could foretell whether violent or non-violent resistance would win the day. I've come to Brown Chapel, the headquarters of the movement here, with the Reverend Fred Reese to find out what course of action the protesters adopted.
During those mass meetings, they were always open with prayer. And our religious upbringing then caused us to really look to the Lord for guidance. We had no guns, but we had our bodies and presented our bodies non-violently.
The movement decided to draw attention to their cause by organising a march from Selma to the state capital in Montgomery, 50 miles away. The state governor immediately declared the march illegal, but in line with their principle of non-violent resistance, the leaders decided to go ahead anyway. And on March 6, 1965, they left Brown Chapel to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge out of town.
Going across that bridge and looking down, I saw a sea of blue state trooper uniform. And then Major Cloud, who was the leader of state troopers, had a bullhorn.
You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church.
And we'd already decided we were not going to turn. And so he gave orders for the state troops to move in on us. But the billy clubs clutched on both ends, literally went down the line of marches, toppling the marches over as if you top of bowling pins in a bowling alley. I saw blood flowing, pandemonium broke out in the crowd, a state of disbelief that this was happening in these United States of America. And they began to pursue us on horseback, back across the bridge, coming back to this church.
Many of those beaten back in such a humiliating way must have had the words of the militants ringing in their ears. The temptation to strike back would have been intense. Yet even now, this extraordinary movement maintained its discipline and focus.
And getting back to this church, I had prayer. And while in this sanctuary, the telephone rang in the pastor's study here. It was Dr. King, and he said that he had signed a call over the nation for ministers and others to come to Selma that same night, about 9 o'clock. A group had chartered a plane from New Jersey and walked in this sanctuary. Said, we have seen on television screen what happened across that bridge, and we have heard the call of Dr. King, and we are here to lend our bodies and our assistance to the people of Selma. And that was one of the most exhilarating and inspiring moments of that day. Then Selma became what I call an ecumenical gathering of all races, all religion, and they wanted to participate for the right to vote.
The next night, King spoke at Brown Chapel and called on the people to continue their costly witness in favor of human dignity.
A man dies when he refuses to take a stand for that which is true. So we're going to stand up right here amid horses, amid billy clubs. We're going to stand up amid tear gas, letting the world know that we are determined to be free. We shall overcome someday.
The brutal treatment of these courageous protesters in Selma shamed the nation, and in Washington, President Lyndon Johnson introduced a bill to Congress guaranteeing voting rights to all Americans.
And we shall overcome.
10 days later, after intervention from the federal government to ensure their safety, Martin Luther King resumed the march on Montgomery. There, on the 25th of March 1965, he addressed the crowds on the imposing steps of the state capitol, the place that's known as the cradle of the Confederacy.
They told us we wouldn't get here. There were those who said that we would get here only over their dead bodies. Well, all the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
There's an amazing symmetry to all this.
What began just over here at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church with the 1955 bus boycott ended up back here 10 years later with King's speech on these steps of the state capitol and the triumphant victory of the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
I sat on that platform and looked out over that sea of humanity at a feeling of great triumph and victory after having gone through all of the indignities, sacrifices that we had made, and now it all seemed worth it. And so that particular march was a march that forever would live in my memory, and certainly I give honor to God for having watched over us, directed us, used me, as well as others, to actually bring about this historic day.
You've got to wonder where the power was. Here, the Capitol, with all the instruments of the state at its disposal, or there across the road at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where black folk, led by preachers, were armed with nothing more than the Bible and the strength of their convictions.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a towering achievement and a testament to King's Christian leadership of the civil rights movement. But it soon became clear that changes in the law, however important, were not enough. In the following months, American cities erupted in racial hatred. Blacks, frustrated by years of poverty and lack of opportunity, turned their backs on King's non-violent methods. Black nationalism and black power began to appeal to increasingly large numbers of African Americans. In the great urban centres of the North and West, more and more blacks looked to a new generation of militants for inspiration and leadership.
The time for running has come to an end.
How would King respond? After Selma, his focus changed dramatically. Taking his civil rights campaigns to towns and cities across the country, he began to voice a radical critique of the American way of life. His emphasis shifted from simple racism to the evils of poverty and greed.
It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power.
As a bit of a teenage revolutionary myself, I would have thought that this might be the moment when Martin Luther King began to be remembered as a champion of the left, a secular radical. I would have expected his religion to fade gently into the background. But that was the very last thing on King's mind.
Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant.
This is an intriguing and surprising side to King. As an outspoken critic of American society, his views were closer to those of socialists than most Christian preachers. Yet his radicalism was expressed in unmistakably biblical terms. I'm on the banks of the Mississippi in Memphis, Tennessee, with a theologian who's traced the development of King's political and social ideas. According to Professor Luther Ivory, once something of a militant himself, King's new thinking flowed from long-held principles.
King just believes that a God of love would not want the beloved community to be hampered by millions and millions of poor people. So he sees that something has to be done about poverty. What to do? He begins to organize what's now known as the Poor People's Campaign in Chicago, working for economic justice. And it is then that King begins to become straight up against raw, naked political power. And he sees that this task is going to be more gargantuan than we thought at first. King is in a no-win situation. The black nationalists at this point don't think King is radical enough. They still believe that King is a naive ideologue who's a reformist. Those who are more reformist think that King has lost his mind and become more black nationalist. So he's caught in between these two forces in the black community, who are forces of leadership. And I think his most agonizing years are from 65 to 68, where almost daily he's trying to weigh himself in the balance, finding himself wanting as a leader.
The pressure on King increased still further in 1967 after he publicly opposed the Vietnam War.
Unjust war in Vietnam.
President Johnson was furious at his one-time ally, and King came under even closer surveillance. In my mind, opposition to the Vietnam War was the defining image of the left in the 60s, and perhaps that's another reason why I've never seen King in religious terms. But as you examine his speeches, you're struck by the fact that the more radical his politics, the more biblical his convictions.
God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now.
Preach it.
God didn't call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war as the war in Vietnam. And we are criminals in that war. We've committed more war crimes almost than any nation in the world, and I'm going to continue to say it.
King's language at this point now becomes much more judgmental. I mean, is this someone who's really raging inside?
I think King at this point really embodies the prophetic personality. King is like a modern-day Amos, or a modern-day Isaiah, or a modern-day Jeremiah. Thus saith the Lord, says the prophets of old. Now, prophet's life is not happy. There's nothing happy about being a prophet. Martin King stood in the marketplace of lies and told the truth, knowing his neck was going to get the axe. And for that reason, for the brother to stand up there and do that, it seems to me that Martin is an example of something we all can do. But he knows there's a heavy price to pay.
There's definitely a prophetic, apocalyptic quality to some of King's oratory that's impressive but also somewhat disturbing. And perhaps here we get to the heart of why King's faith is in danger of being written out of the story. In today's world, we often see religion as trouble. Far from being a solution, we see it as part of the problem. Unreasonable, divisive, militant. Aren't we more than a little bit afraid of the preacher king?
God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me.
Don't play, boy. Amen.
Be still and know that I'm God. And if you don't stop your reckless course, I'll rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Yes.
And that can happen to America.
It has to be said that after 9/11, this sort of language makes us feel really uneasy. I mean, we don't want to hear preachers talking about God visiting his judgment on the nation because we worry it inspires terrorism. But Martin Luther King's religion wasn't visiting hellfire and damnation on anyone. In fact, it was the exact opposite. He was saying, we will suffer so that the poor and oppressed of the world receive justice. We will suffer so that eventually all will go free. And surely that's a message we should admire, not ignore.
It's obvious religious commitment isn't always a force for ill, but our secular society likes to forget it can be a force for good. King believed that commitment always comes with a personal cost. And he was particularly aware of that when he campaigned in Memphis in 1968. He'd come here to support the sanitation workers in their struggle for decent conditions. And on the night of April the 3rd, he left his room at the Lorraine Motel to deliver what was supposed to be a routine address. It's come to be known as the Mountaintop Speech, his most famous after the Dream speech 5 years earlier. It also turned out to be his last.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, as he stood waiting on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, King was shot dead by a sniper's bullet. To the end, he was still working to rid America of the triple evils of racism, greed, and war, the evils that finally conspired to kill him.
How I got over.
And since his death, he suffered another posthumous injustice. Here's a man who interpreted the issues of his time in the light of his Christian faith, who from first to last saw himself as a Baptist minister and also as a prophet called by God to redeem the soul of America. At one time, these facts might have left me thinking, so what if King's religion fades into obscurity? What does it matter if all we're left with is a few secular soundbites? But this quest for the preacher king has persuaded me otherwise.
I finally realised what it is we lose if we ignore Martin Luther King's religion. For a start, historical accuracy, and that's no small thing, but it's more than that. We lose his soul. And for a man as uniquely passionate, powerful, humble, loving, revolutionary, spiritual, and beautiful as Martin Luther King, that would be a truly terrible loss.
You know my soul, look back and wonder how I got over. Oh Lord, how I got over. How I got over. You know my soul, look back and wonder how I got over.